Hey there, Happy New Year and welcome to Checkmate. I'm Christian Hanley. This is the first episode of Checkmate, a new series that will put news and current events into perspective. Broadcast and cable TV news shows chase down the day's stories, but they really aren't able to put what's going on in our day-to-day lives into a larger context. Even when they introduce experts to connect the dots, they often end up explaining how today's news relates to yesterday's news or make predictions about what will happen tomorrow. With notable exceptions, the analysis is often weak. Critical points are left unsaid, and context critical to understanding the story is glossed over. In this series, we'll take a step back from the traditional format and discuss how what we are living now fits into the big picture. Whether it's putting our current constitutional crisis into historical or global perspective, or revealing the actors and the motivations behind the headlines, we'll be focusing on quality, not hype. We won't be chasing any tweets, and we won't do any knee-jerk reactions. And this won't be the place for breaking news either. Instead, we'll take one or a few stories at a time, break them down, and make sense of them. It's not news to anyone that we are living in frightening times, and while 2016 was a pivotal moment in our history, we didn't get to where we are now as a country as the result of one election. Our country has sustained several lurches to the right, each one pushing us further and further into dysfunction. While news outlets excel at chasing the big story, they just can't chart how off course our country has gone as the right wing has become increasingly radical. They can put today's news in the context of what has happened this week, but when it comes to the longer-term political and cultural trends, they tend to follow those trends rather than critique and report on them. It's why a cable news channel can talk about how Donald Trump and the Republicans' 2018 tax scam will affect our tax returns next year, but they can't talk about how we got to this point in our country, where duly elected members of Congress would even be able to buy into the nonsense idea that slashing taxes for the extremely wealthy will do anything for the American economy. To do that, to put a year's, a month's, or a week's story into the context of the era in which we're living, we need to slow it down and take a step back. It's popular to say that we live in an age of hyper-partisanship and division, and that we're in a post-fact era. That all may be true, but the war on consensus governing, on facts and on basic reality, did not begin with Donald Trump. In fact, it's been the spearhead of the radical Republican agenda for nearly 4 decades. 36 years before the 2016 election, Ronald Reagan began the now infamous War on Truth. He attacked established economic realities, distorted accepted truths about the role of government, and cast aspersions on poor and working people in this country. All while Trump was just a tacky real estate developer in New York. Reagan's election meant the end of an era in which facts, science, and reason played the greatest roles in setting policy, and in which Americans had faith in their federal government. Think of everything that our country had achieved in decades prior, from the New Deal to defeating Nazi Germany, to voting rights, anti-poverty legislation, environmental protection, even putting a man on the moon. All of this was achieved from the Great Depression in the 1930s through the 1970s. And indeed, much of it was achieved just between the end of World War II and the 1960s. And it took compromise, reasoned debate, and a shared understanding of facts, along with faith in our government. When he first rose to national political prominence, Reagan was correctly seen as extreme, as the head of a national right-wing backlash who bucked America's governing consensus, assailed members of his own party with bogus ideas that George H.W. Bush infamously called voodoo economics, and courted Southern racists and ex-Dixiecrats by announcing his support of states' rights when launching his campaign in the same Mississippi county where 3 civil rights workers had been slaughtered just 16 years prior. His presidency set us down a rightward path from which we have never recovered. Since his former rival accepted defeat and became his vice president, every successive president has had to govern in Reagan's shadow. The result has been Republican presidents raising the debt and funding giveaways to corporate interests, not to mention starting needless wars. And it's meant a Democratic president slashing benefits for low-income families. All this in the name of ending quote-unquote big government that helped save the world from fascism, that invested in education and research, that intervened when states oppressed their residents, and that had begun the intricate and difficult task of tackling poverty and balancing the interests of the wealthy against the needs of the people. In other words, the government Reagan hated. Without this context, cable news today touts Ronald Reagan as a heroic figure, a reasonable and noble man whose character stands in stark contrast to the vulgar and petulant Donald Trump. They conveniently forget that he started in politics in California as an unqualified movie star, who subsequently gutted America's working class and elevated dog whistle racism to a near art form. But the point here isn't to bash a former president. It's that traditional news media has followed Reagan and every subsequent rightward lurch as the new norm, as the political center is drawn farther and farther to the right by increasingly radical Republicans. The news media presents stories and debates on terms set by conservatives, setting an ever more rightward point on the political spectrum as the so-called center. Thoughtful debate, reasoned critique, and understanding of policy have all suffered as a consequence. Now in 2018, more level-headed conservatives are lauded as heroes. They take the place of liberals and progressives on TV debates, and their prior records are all but forgotten. At a time when carnival barkers like Alex Jones have an Infowar president in the White House, Reagan Republicans are given a platform and treated as the adults in the room. After all, everything is relative. The problem is that many of these conservatives not only ideologically adhere to the ravings of Reagan, but they played active roles in the George W. Bush administration, a national disaster whose destructiveness is only now being forgotten because of the truly terrifying specter of a genuine madman in the Oval Office. We can't forget that while Reagan's legacy may be more enduring ideologically, it was Bush's presidency that altered the course of American history in a way that never should have happened. It was Bush, a man less intelligent and less ethical than even Reagan, who subverted democracy itself in Florida, scurrying for a court order to stop the recount and gain the White House by judicial decree rather than through a free and fair election. It was Bush who benefited from purges of voter rolls in Florida before the 2000 election that disproportionately targeted black voters. It was Bush who took the White House without a clear electoral win, and who helped keep it 4 years later with more election irregularities in Ohio. After prying the presidency from the hands of the majority of Americans, Bush went on to use it to move America yet further to the right. With as much understanding of global affairs and economics as Reagan, Bush launched 2 wars in which we are now still engaged a decade and a half later, and sunk the American economy into the greatest crisis since the Great Depression. We see now that the media, rather than being able to analyze current events against the backdrop of the recent past, forgets the recent past all but immediately. Because of this media amnesia, the winners of yesterday's political battles can dictate the narrative of today's news and set the terms on which the most important issues of our day are debated. For all the talk of liberal media, the right, from the few remaining conservative Democrats to Reagan Republicans to even Trump fanatics, have more than their fair share of representation. More importantly, their all too recent sins and their complicity in creating the new and dreadful norm in which the media and American political culture now exist are largely forgotten as one news or opinion show or another mistakes our warped present reality for what should have been the status quo. I'm not a journalist, and I'm not here to break news or report. I'm a Democrat, and if it makes me progressive to believe that everyone needs healthcare, education, and employment if they want it, and that women and people of color are equals deserving of a seat at the table, then I'm also a progressive. I train as a lawyer, not as a reporter, but I don't practice law. I work with Democrats and aligned organizations as a strategist and consultant. I don't believe that we should return to a mythical golden age when the working class and the middle class were content and social problems were nowhere to be found. That time never existed. The United States didn't invent the modern state, a place in which citizens had a share in the economy and a say in the nation's future, at least provided they were white. It is because of this stain of racial segregation and exclusion that the mid-20th century offers us a great economic model and some of the lowest moments in our history at the same time. But it should be lost on nobody that the tide was at last changing. After the New Deal became the Great Society, and economic security was set to become the norm for not just average white Americans, but for all Americans, it was then that the Reagan Revolution happened. The Republican rule took root, and that progress was thwarted. We find ourselves making up for lost time, finally building the multiracial participatory democracy that our predecessors set out to create a half-century ago. Thanks to a new wave of brilliant and inspiring Democratic women of color entering Congress today, we may do just that. We may, after the expulsion of the current occupant of the White House, finally begin the process of creating the world's first true pluralistic democracy, with participation in public life and the economy open to all, regardless of race, sex, or other previous and arbitrary disqualifying factor. In this arena, my role is to support this new, inspiring, and diverse cohort of leaders and their successors. The backlash against our new and diverse Democratic Party have been swift and indecent, laced with sexism and racism, whether the criticisms have arisen within our party, across party lines, or in the news media. Any adult is capable of defending his or herself, but they need not do so for every affront. The duty of calling out racism belongs to white people. The obligation to dismantle misogyny belongs to men. In our new politics, those who have been held back need not defend and support themselves all on their own. That is the responsibility of the people who have heretofore credited themselves as allies. If we truly aspire to the future that a new and diverse Democratic Party offers our country in the 21st century, I, can ask no less of ourselves. In this series, I won't yell, scream, or slander, but I'm also not here to play nice. After nearly 40 years of professional spin doctors moving our politics to the right and stoking hatred rather than healing long open wounds, our country, now divided and in danger of foreign influence with Trump in office, teeters on a precipice. I'm here to do what journalists cannot and perhaps should not do: fight back. I'm Christian Hanley, and this is Checkmate. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join the fight with me.